Before this story takes you anywhere, before your mind tries to rush ahead and decide what kind of person I am, pause for just a moment. Seriously. Just one moment. And while you're here, before we begin, take a second to subscribe to the channel. Not because this story is shocking, not because it's dramatic, but because the kinds of stories shared here are the ones people usually keep buried. They're the ones people whisper about only when the lights are off and the world is quiet. If you've ever sat in a crowded room and still felt invisible. If you've ever questioned your own thoughts because they frightened you. If you've ever realized that some stories aren't told to justify behavior, but to understand how a person slowly loses themselves, then this channel is for you. Because what you're about to hear isn't entertainment. It isn't a scandal. It isn't something designed to help you escape reality for 10 minutes. This is a confession. And once you hear it, you can't pretend you never did. Life rarely warns you about its most dangerous moments. They don't arrive with loud music. They don't knock on the door and politely introduce themselves. They don't announce, "Careful. What happens next will change everything." No. The most dangerous moments in life arrive quietly. They hide inside ordinary days. They slip into routine. They disguise themselves as kindness, concern, or small harmless gestures. And before you even realize it, the line you thought was clear, the one you believed you would never cross, is suddenly behind you. And you're standing somewhere you never meant to be. The worst part is that sometimes you don't even notice the moment when things began to shift. You only see it when you look back. And by then, it's already too late. I never imagined I would tell a story like this. Not with this voice. Not with this weight pressing against my chest. And definitely not with the kind of honesty that makes your hands feel cold even when you're alone in the room. 2 years have passed since everything began. 2 years. That's not a very long time when you say it out loud. But somehow it feels like decades have lived inside those months. Time didn't simply move forward after that point. It folded in on itself. Every day since then has carried an echo of something I wish I had never heard. And a realization I wish I had never faced. But stories like this never begin with something dramatic. They begin small. So small, in fact, that if you described the moment to someone else, they would probably laugh and say you're overthinking it. A sore muscle. A simple request. An act of kindness. That's the cruel irony of human mistakes. They almost never start with desire. They start with vulnerability. They start with a moment when someone simply needs help, and another person chooses to give it. And if you're not careful, that small moment grows roots. And those roots grow deeper than you ever intended. People often think loneliness means being alone. But that isn't the cruelest kind. The cruelest loneliness is being unseen. It's waking up beside someone who no longer reaches for you. It's speaking words that disappear before they ever reach another person. It's smiling because it has become a habit, not because something actually made you happy. I had been married for 12 years. 12 years of shared meals, shared bills, shared responsibilities, shared routines. From the outside, our life looked stable, maybe even comfortable. We had a house that functioned well, responsibilities divided neatly, and the quiet rhythm of 2 adults who had learned how to coexist without conflict. But somewhere along the way, we stopped sharing ourselves. And the strangest part is that there was no single moment when it happened. No explosive fight. No betrayal that shattered everything overnight. Nothing dramatic enough to mark on a calendar and say, "That's the day things fell apart." Instead, it happened slowly. So slowly that I barely noticed it at first. First, he stopped asking how my day went. Then he stopped really listening when I answered anyway. Eventually, he stopped looking at me the way people look at someone they love. Not out of cruelty. Not out of anger. Just absence. He was always busy. Always working. Always thinking about something else. Deadlines. Finals. Projects. Responsibilities. Things that were important. Things that mattered. But somehow, I had quietly moved to the bottom of that list. And I told myself that was normal. That marriages settle. That passion fades. That wanting more attention after a decade together was childish and unrealistic. So I adapted. I became efficient. Predictable. Useful. I cooked without complaint. Cleaned without being asked. organized the house so smoothly that nothing ever seemed out of place. Everything ran like a perfectly maintained machine. And inside that quiet efficiency, I slowly disappeared. Ethan had been part of my life since he was 11. My husband's son from his first marriage. When I first met him, he was a quiet kid with sharp elbows, messy hair, and the kind of cautious silence you see in children who learned early that speaking too much could cause problems. He observed more than he talked. Stayed out of the way. Never asked for much. Something about that reminded me of myself when I was younger. Maybe that's why I tried harder to make sure he felt welcome. Not because I had to, because I remembered what it felt like to be overlooked. Years passed the way they always do. Quietly. Gradually. One day you're helping a child with homework, and the next day that same child is taller than you and leaving the house with friends. Ethan grew. He became stronger, more confident, more certain of himself. But what surprised me most wasn't the physical change. It was how observant he became. He noticed small things most people overlooked. The way I paused before answering certain questions. The way I tied my hair back when I felt anxious. The way I stayed in the kitchen late at night pretending to clean dishes that were already spotless. He never pointed it out. Never asked uncomfortable questions. Never made the moment awkward. He simply noticed. And when someone has gone unseen for a long time, being noticed doesn't feel dangerous. It feels like relief. The day everything shifted didn't feel important at the time. There was no music. No warning. No sudden feeling that life was about to divide into before and after. It was just another ordinary afternoon. Ethan came home from soccer practice looking slightly uncomfortable, trying to hide a limp that wasn't quite obvious unless you were paying attention. Just a small twist, he said. Nothing serious. But the way he winced when he stepped forward made it clear that something hurt. He asked if we had anything for the pain. And I did what any adult in the house would have done. I offered to help. I grabbed a small bottle of lotion from the cabinet and told him to sit down so I could check if the muscle was tight. There was nothing strange about the moment. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing planned. Just a practical gesture of care. But when my hands rested on his shoulder as I checked the tension in his muscles, something inside me paused. Not because it felt wrong. Because it felt human. Warmth. Presence. Connection. 3 things I hadn't felt in a very long time. And that realization alone was frightening. He turned his head slightly, glancing back for just a second. Not long. Not dramatic. Just enough to meet my eyes. And then he said something so quietly that part of me wondered if I had imagined it. Sometimes, he said slowly, you're the only person in this house who actually notices when something's wrong. The room went silent. Not an uncomfortable silence, but the kind that forces you to think. Because in that moment, I wasn't reacting to him. I was confronting myself. The part of me that realized how long it had been since anyone truly noticed me. How long it had been since someone looked at me with genuine awareness instead of routine familiarity. And that realization felt heavier than I expected. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No sudden change. No shooking moment. The evening continued the way most evenings do. Dinner was made. Conversations were short. The television filled the living room with background noise. But something had shifted quietly inside my mind. Because once a person realizes how invisible they've felt, they start noticing every moment they aren't. And once silence has been broken, it never returns exactly the same. The strange thing about quiet realizations is that they don't explode into your life all at once. They settle in slowly. Like fog. At first you barely notice it. Then suddenly you realize the entire landscape around you has changed. That night after Ethan mentioned noticing when something was wrong, I told myself it was nothing. Just a passing moment. Just a teenager expressing gratitude in an awkward way. But something about the way he said it stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because the words were extraordinary. Because they were sincere. And sincerity has a way of cutting deeper than anything dramatic ever could. The following days returned to their usual rhythm. Morning routines. Work schedules. Grocery lists. Dishes stacked neatly beside the sink. From the outside, nothing about our household had changed. My husband still left early in the morning, always in a hurry, always checking his phone, always mentally somewhere else before the door even closed behind him. Ethan still went to school, came home in the afternoon, and disappeared into homework, sports practice, or the quiet independence that comes with growing older. Everything looked exactly the same. But inside my mind, something had begun shifting. Because once you become aware of being seen, you start noticing the difference everywhere. I began catching small moments I had ignored before, like how Ethan would pause in the doorway before walking into a room, as if making sure he wasn't interrupting something, or how he would sometimes ask simple questions that most people wouldn't bother with. Did work go okay today? Are you tired? Did something happen? They were ordinary questions, but the way he asked them carried genuine curiosity. And that curiosity was something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. Meanwhile, the distance between my husband and me continued stretching quietly. Not in anger. Not in arguments. Just absence. Some nights we sat in the same room without speaking more than a few sentences. Two people living parallel lives under the same roof. I told myself this was normal. That marriages evolve. That stability often replaces excitement. But deep down, I knew the truth was more uncomfortable than that. We hadn't evolved. We had simply stopped trying. Weeks passed. Then one evening something small happened that forced me to see everything more clearly. It was late. The house was quiet. My husband had fallen asleep on the couch with the television still playing some muted late-night program. I was standing in the kitchen, rinsing a plate that had already been cleaned twice. The water ran longer than necessary because the sound filled the silence. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Ethan walked in, grabbing a glass from the cabinet. He hesitated when he noticed I was still awake. "You're up late again," he said. I gave the same automatic answer I had given countless times before. "Just finishing up." He looked at the spotless counter, the empty sink, the perfectly organized kitchen. For a moment he didn't say anything. Then he said something that caught me off guard. "You do that a lot." "Do what?" I asked. "Pretend you're busy when you're actually just standing here." I laughed softly, trying to brush it off. Maybe I just like clean kitchens. But he didn't laugh. Instead he leaned against the counter, arms folded. "You don't look happy when you're doing it." The comment hung in the air. Not accusing. Not judgmental. Just observant. And suddenly I realized something uncomfortable. He had been paying attention for much longer than I thought. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands slowly. "Everyone gets tired sometimes," I said. "That's different," he replied quietly. I didn't know how to respond to that. So the conversation drifted away like so many others had. But that night I couldn't sleep, because I kept thinking about something simple. A teenager had noticed the emotional exhaustion in my face, and the person I had spent 12 years with hadn't. That realization was heavier than I expected. Not because it made Ethan special, but because it forced me to confront how disconnected my marriage had become. And once you recognize that kind of distance, it becomes impossible to ignore. The real turning point came a few weeks later. Not through drama. Not through conflict. Through honesty. My husband came home late that night, later than usual. He looked exhausted, dropping his bag by the door. I asked if everything was okay. He sighed and sat down heavily at the table. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. "I think we've been pretending for a while." The words landed softly but carried enormous weight. "Pretending?" I asked. "That everything is fine," he said. He rubbed his temples before continuing. "I know I haven't been present. Work took over my life more than I realized." For the first time in years, we actually talked. Not about chores. Not about schedules. About us. About how slowly we had drifted apart without meaning to. About how routine had replaced connection. And how silence had become easier than confronting the truth. The conversation lasted hours. There were no accusations. Just quiet understanding. And by the end of that night, we both realized something painful but necessary. Our marriage hadn't collapsed. It had simply ended long before we admitted it. Sometimes relationships don't explode. They fade. Slowly enough that you don't notice until the color is already gone. Over the following months, We began separating our lives with surprising calm. There were difficult moments, of course, but also relief. Because honesty, even painful honesty, weighs less than years of silent pretending. Ethan handled the news better than I expected. One evening he sat across from me at the table and said something that stayed with me. "Sometimes people grow in different directions," he said. It was such a simple sentence, but it carried more wisdom than most adults manage to express. Life eventually moved forward the way it always does. New routines formed. New spaces opened. And the house that once felt heavy with silence slowly became just another chapter of the past. I don't tell this story because something shocking happened. Nothing scandalous. Nothing dramatic. No forbidden moment that destroyed everything. The real story is quieter than that. It's about how easy it is to lose yourself when you stop being seen. And how dangerous loneliness can become when it lives inside a life that looks perfectly normal from the outside. But it's also about something else. Awareness. Because the moment you realize you've been disappearing, you have a choice. You can keep pretending, or you can face the truth and start rebuilding the parts of yourself that slowly faded away. 2 years have passed since those realizations began. Sometimes I still think about how small the first moment was. A sore shoulder. A quiet observation. A simple reminder that someone noticed. And maybe that's the lesson hidden inside this confession. The moments that change our lives rarely look important at the time. They arrive quietly. They hide inside ordinary days. But if we're paying attention, they can also be the moments that wake us up before we lose ourselves completely. If this story made you pause and reflect, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real confessions that reveal the quiet truths people rarely talk about. And if you've ever faced a moment that changed the way you see life, share your thoughts in the comments below.